Good morning, one and all. And I want to talk to you about the core subject of this conference today, which is lessons for the vernacular and why the vernacular is such an important issue and question for all. Sorry. Why do we need... Sorry, we'll start from the beginning now. Now, there are 4 parts to my talk. Number 1 is, why do we need radical new design thinking? 2 is, what can we learn from the vernacular? 3 is, how may we learn from the vernacular? And then 4 is, who must innovate to survive? Why do we need radical new design thinking? Well, the lead issue at the moment is climate change, because our world is heating and carbon emission reductions are crucial, and buildings play such a large part in that. And then the really pressing need now is to be able to design for extreme weather events that are becoming the norm. The recent IPCC report, 21 report, shows that we have unequivocal heating of the world. And we all know this, and the evidence is overwhelming now. It's undeniable. But every ton of CO2 emissions adds to global warming. And if you look now at where we are now, in terms of the temperature of the planet, we are getting on for about 1.5 degrees centigrade warmer than the 20th century average. But see how rapidly it's projected to rise in the future. By the time we get to 2050, very, very short time away, it'll be up 2.5 to 3 degrees centigrade if we carry on with business as usual. Now, this is a chart we published in our book on adapting buildings and cities for climate change, and it's rather bleak. Buildings will increasingly fail to provide protection against more extreme weather. It's happening already. So we have to increase building resilience. Communities, where you have non-functional communities, they become challenged. So we have to functionalize communities. We have to build resilient communities as well. Infrastructure, we're getting systemic failures. And we've seen this around the world, whether it's bridges washed out or grids collapsing. So we need to fortify infrastructures. But the one that people often ignore is system capacity. Inequality in societies are magnified, meaning that as we have more people, they have less each. So we have to capacity plan and resource allocate, and that has to be systematized. And as we heard in the opening, the Middle East is experiencing, like all other places of the world, these terrific extremes. In Oman last June, on the 7th of June, we had temperatures above 50 degrees centigrade. And it's predicted, there's a lot of good science predicting the types of temperature Oman will experience in the future. A couple of weeks ago, we had this, there was a terrific cyclone also mentioned, which had catastrophic effects on the infrastructure of the country. And here we come to the system capacity issue, because everywhere, however apparently advanced it is, has these challenges, and not least in the provision of water. And you can see that Lake Mead already is getting to below the 1,000-foot intakes that are used to generate electricity from the dam, but also provide water for Las Vegas. And yet people are still watering the golf courses, and there must be something like 15 golf courses around Las Vegas. So at some point, the system capacity issue will kick in. For climate change, we saw we need to build resilient buildings. We need to functionalize communities, fortify infrastructure, and systematize capacity planning. But let's look at the other wild card here, which is the energy problem. Modern buildings simply use too much energy. Modern buildings do not often protect from extreme weather. Fossil fuel energy to heat and cool is becoming unaffordable. Power outages are commonplace, and modern fixed window buildings perform very badly in pandemics. We know this from around the world. Here's a shot of Buenos Aires. You can tell the age of the building simply from its form. So here we have 1910 buildings, 1915 buildings, and 1960s, and gradually over time, they become more and more shut off from the environment around them. And with consequences, here you can see CO2 per meter square of treated floor area, large glass prestige buildings use 3, 4, 5 times, even if it's a good practice one, than traditional heavyweight vernacular building that's naturally ventilated. So something is wrong here. Why are we getting increasingly energy guzzling buildings? Well, not least because the building regulations, the international guidelines and standards, and even the rating schemes are pushing ever more high prestige glass shut off buildings. Here's an example, the LEED rating scheme. These are LEED platinum buildings. I look on them almost as being climate crimes. LEED was actually designed to promote high energy buildings. LEED, like any other green building rating scheme, is a simple point hunting approach. When it was first written, you could achieve LEED silver without actually improving the energy performance of the building. And in the basket of points, energy efficiency may be achieved only by improving mechanical, electrical, and hot water systems, and by adding PV. That was how LEED was shaped. There was no need to improve the architectural design of the building to get LEED platinum. The basic design of the building that is essential for improving resilience. You couldn't actually get LEED platinum for a naturally ventilated building. Why would they do that? These are extremely dangerous buildings. They are brittle, peaky, unresilient, high energy buildings. And look what happens when you have peaky buildings, you have a peaky city. So at extremes of air conditioning peak loads or heating peak loads, the energy supply systems simply push the systems beyond their capacity. So the lights go out. And they are not resilient buildings. I mean, which building would you rather be in during a cyclone? A building that moves 7 or 8 feet in each direction at the top when the wind is high, or one in which you would be perfectly safe against every onslaught? But another problem is one which is widespread, it's international, is that fuel poverty exists even in richer Europe and the USA. And here, this is a map of the income classes, average income classes for nations. Even in Europe, you've got some countries like Bulgaria, with nearly 40% of people cannot afford to keep their home adequately warm. And this is just European countries. We have a number of issues around the cost of energy too. There are politically dangerous energy price subsidies. For instance, while in Australia it costs 0.449 of a cent, an US cent for a kilowatt hour of electricity, 0.21 in the UK. That's historic. It's even more now. In some countries where there are energy price subsidies, to take those off is politically challenging. And what we have another phenomenon is in the sort of decline of global capitalism, we see the disappearing middle classes. So the top 20% over the last decades have done better and better. And yet the second 20%, the bulk of the middle classes, and the third and the fourth 20% their incomes are declining. So everything is going up, but the incomes are declining. And here we have also the capacity issue. Systemic power outages in Pakistan, India, across the Gulf even. Sharjah in particular has had real problems when the lights go out. And if it's 50 degrees centigrade outside your building and the lights go out, you have a problem. And then Philomena is going to be, Bluesen is going to be talking about pandemics. What we know now about COVID-19 is that it is spread indoors with airstreams. So it doesn't matter whether you've got a HEPA filter in that duct. As soon as the airstream hits a room, this is now well documented. This is a Chinese restaurant with no opening windows. The airstream goes across the infection source and then infects people downwind. If you cannot purge those buildings by opening windows, you have a problem. So climate change, again, we need to look at all of these issues that arose to begin with about building resilience. So what about the vernacular? What can the vernacular teach us? Vernacular buildings teach us how to harvest free local energy simply through the building form, its materials and orientation. Vernacular buildings teach us how to store free energy in the material so we can load shift and load shave. We can use the coolth of the night to cool a building during the day. Vernacular buildings teach us how to transport energy around buildings and cities, and they teach us how to simply survive to avoid collapse during climate extremes. And they've only evolved to be able to do so because lifestyles, our behaviors have co-evolved with local microclimates in those buildings. And they also teach us how to power buildings naturally in different landscapes with local natural energy. And they also teach us the value of time. Vernacular buildings are slow buildings. They evolve over decades, centuries, and millennia of learning. They are regionally, climatically, socially, and economically appropriate designs, designed for their climates. Here, for instance, I'm going to use wind catch as an example. Here are the wind catchers of Yazd in the 15th century, in the Timurid period, small, low, and gradually with economic prosperity coming in the 19th century, not least with the wealth that flooded into the city from the opium trade to China, the wind towers became more and more elaborate, but with the introduction of electricity, they became obsolete. as people use fans and air conditioners. So they have a very different role. They have an evolution over time. Let's look at some fast architecture. This is the Hilton Hotel in the main street of Dubai. This is in 1991. This is it, 30 years later. This is fast architecture. Can you believe that? It's extraordinary. With two very different trajectories from 30 years ago to now. We come from a long tradition of vernacular, regionally appropriate buildings in which lives went on without grid energy. In the 1950s, the wide-scale electrification of cities came with an expansion, a growing of building types, which upon that electricity and those models grew the great cities of today. This is the 2020s trajectory. But honestly, looking into your souls, do you see that that is the future of safe, resilient buildings and cities in a rapidly changing climate? Comfort at the extremes without grid energy. And here's a book we did earlier on running buildings on natural energy. I'd like to show you the case study of the extraordinary sophistication of wind catchers in Iran. These are the wind catchers of Yazd that cool people in the hottest deserts. How do they do it? They capture free energy. They capture the coolth of the sky, the wind from which direction they want. They take warmth and coolth from the earth and the sun. They are uniquely adapted in all the different parts of the all different climates. So a simple wind catcher is very different in Bahrain or Baghdad, or even the modern ones in Yazd or down by the sea, or in Karachi, or in the high mountain buildings of Mashhad or Afghanistan. They are locally appropriate. They also use lots of different sorts of energy to upgrade what they have. I mean, they convert qanat water into ice. They use gravity to push water from the mountains into settlements in the hot desert plains for drinking and milling and washing and cooking. For instance, with the qanat water, it's carrying water from the mountains with this series of wells to the cities below. This is into Yazd, where you have to go down deep to actually access the water. But here in the basements of Yazd, those qanats are linked to the basement rooms. And it is the wind catchers, which is used as the wind air technology, that pushes air down into the basement rooms and draws it up from the basement rooms and functionalizes and transports that spread of coolth throughout the building. So these are extraordinarily sophisticated environments, and also occupants have to move between the microclimates over the day or the years. So they'll sleep under the beautiful stars at night and go down to the cool basements in the day. So we know that vernacular architecture is hugely sophisticated and elegant, having evolved over millennia. But how can we learn from the vernacular? We have to actually study vernacular buildings because we've forgotten a lot of their lessons. I know that from having written a book about the ice houses of Britain and the Middle East, where people had completely forgotten about how ice was made in the deserts. We forget things really quickly, and the young generation know nothing of that vernacular wisdom, so they have to relearn it because it's important for our survival. But it's not just the buildings, but the ecologies of the environments they're placed in, their context. A building is not a cardboard box. It is connected to the ecologies around it. Well, we have to take those lessons and adapt them to modern design challenges. We have to borrow design ideas from future climates, and we can do that by analogy. And we have to develop an experience-driven design process. Students all should study vernacular buildings in situ. They should go out into record the temperatures, how they're designed, and try and get to the understanding of those ostards or the master builders who built them. They can do that with innovative work in laboratories and do it largely in the field. And if you go to the sbse.org resources website, you can see a lot of different resources that can be used and available for doing in situ case studies of vernacular buildings. We have to then say, obviously, the vernacular was not fitted and adapted to future buildings and future conditions and current economic and social understandings. Isaac Mayer and myself did a chapter on the future of the vernacular, where we looked at how you take measurements and understanding in fieldwork and then use it to systematically develop understandings of the differences of parametric building types, for instance. So we need to systematically and intelligently apply those vernacular learnings to the way we design buildings today. And buildings today must be designed for climates of the future. Here's some work done by Jake Hacker at Arups, where he said, look, how do we instinctively, architects are not very good at reading books, how do we instinctively understand what sort of design measures should we be taking? So what he did was take London in the 2080s, and he looked for a comparable climate, and he found Marseille in 1961 to 90, that climate would be very similar to London in the 2080s. So simply get yourself a comparable building. How far forward? Do you want to be designing for the 2050s or the 2080s or the 2100s? Get a climate profile for a different place that is hotter and look at how they design buildings. That's one way of doing it. From his work and that of Michael Holmes at Arups, he came up with how do you beat the heat? How do we design for a hotter future? And he said, switch off, spread out, blow away, and cool. So shade should be used to switch off the sun. Internal gains can be controlled. Distribute the gains to reduce peaks in spaces by means of thermal mass. Store it in that. Use properly defined ventilation strategies, nighttime cooling, for example, and only use cooling when necessary. And this is the big new development now. In the last couple of years, buildings of the future are being seen as being mixed mode, because when the lights go out, you have to be able to open a window. And when a pandemic hits, the only way to rapidly purge a space of high viral load is to open the windows quickly. So hospitals should all be mixed mode. And we've now got a study out of Scottish hospitals showing that infection clusters of COVID in the latest fixed window air-conditioned building are significantly higher than in the traditional hospitals where you could open windows, and they do open windows regularly in a ventilation regime. We're talking about 3 or 4 times more COVID in those fixed window hospitals. So mixed mode is the future. And one thing I learned when I was working in Antarctica in 2019 and 2020, you can see that yurt, which is an extremely resilient structure we designed to survive in Antarctica. This is for remote, at a glacier, Collins Glacier, for remote climate sciences researchers, for them to live safely, even if it's 100, 150 mile an hour wind in minus 20 and 30 degrees centigrade. This tent has proved absolutely astounding in the way it can withstand such extreme conditions. But we found then that extreme design is a process. It's not a product. So you have to go to the exact site for a development and study its environs in great depth. What are the wind flow patterns around it? I'm talking about extreme designs here. You have to source and study appropriate vernacular archetypes for inspiration. And you can see here we used a Mongolian yurt as the basic, and then we used extreme materials and different features in a triple skin tent. We simulated improvements to the traditional structure for that proposed site, but we only used simulation when it was useful. We explored innovative materials and structural solutions with experts. So we went to talk to people who knew how things worked, not what they said on their websites or, you know, sort of the PR and the promos. We went to the source of knowledge, which are the experts in individual elements. You know, how do you build a guy rope and stuff? We then tested the field structures. We tested the tent, a similar tent in a cold store facility at minus 20 degrees centigrade in Hull in England. Did field tests and lab tests, and we finalized the structural design element with tent makers. So we asked the experts on how do you make tents to help us refine it. We then transported it and built it on site, measured conditions in it to see how it was responding, and then monitored the year after for strengths and weaknesses in the design. You'll notice that simulation is only a small part in that process. It's the process of testing and prototyping and making it site specific that's important. Too much of modern design is done with crude simulation tools only. They are very limited. For instance, a lot of the programs deal with natural ventilation very poorly, thermal mass very poorly. They are only useful when they're useful. We should be training and educating a generation of profound thinkers, not CAD monkeys. How do we learn from the vernacular? We teach students to feel and understand buildings better. We connect students early on with people who actually build buildings, who know how materials work. We use that learning for myth-busting exercises. We teach original thinking because we're going to need to learn very fast in a rapidly changing world. We teach design as a process, not as a model product. And we ensure that people who teach design can actually design themselves. Who must innovate to survive? It all depends on what your values are. And this is now, we're getting value-driven developments. Perhaps it's time to listen to Greta Thunberg when she says, "Come clean." No one is too small to make a difference. We all have to change, and we all have to change rapidly, because that 20th century dream of developments is no longer fit for purpose in a world of extremes. We need a new vernacular, regionally and climatically appropriate buildings. And we have 10 years to make a difference, but we all must change in order to do that. We must understand, again, going back to hazard, and we cover this all in our book, Adapting Buildings and Cities for Climate Change. Hazard, the risk triangle. How exposed are you? How bad is the hazard? How exposed are you to that hazard? How long can you survive? How vulnerable are you? How strong is your house? How strong is your office? What's your health? How good is your community? How wealthy are you? Can you buy your way out of it? As we saw senators doing in the Texan ice storm. We have to understand building risk. Nationally, I mean, here's some advice. Nationally, establish multidisciplinary task force of independent experts to review all regulations. No one should be allowed to decide on developments that they can financially benefit from. We need to de-risk that process. We need to reduce pollution in cities so that people can safely open their windows. We need to amend planning laws so that we get rid of deep plan buildings, so you can have buildings that can be naturally lit, naturally ventilated in a very unpredictable future. We need to windscape cities to prevent extreme impacts of cyclones. And there's a lot of work being done in Sri Lanka at the moment just on this. And we need to create climate refuges. I mean, we have to wake up and understand that we already live in a dangerous climates. So places where people can escape to be cool in extreme heat, to be warm in extreme cold, and to be dry in the extreme wet. What about the future? I mean, in Oman, you're very lucky because you haven't gone what I see a very dangerous route of the tall glass buildings road. Maybe buildings will only be 10 stories in future. That 10 stories is what a fully clothed fireman can reach safely in an extreme fire. So 10 stories, 4 stories, what can you carry a bucket of water up to? 6 stories, what can you comfortably climb up to? Who knows? Steps have to be taken so that development is not seen purely as a money laundering opportunity. These are zombie developments in Ankara in Turkey, and we've seen what the zombie developments of China are doing to the entire Chinese economy now with the evergreen fiasco. So maybe we need to, at a top level, get a grip on why we design. So we get short cities and we get thin cities. This is Berlin. Berlin has a planning mandate that you can only design buildings which are so wide because they have to be able to be naturally ventilated and naturally lit. How sensible is that? And again, these recommendations are in a book, a chapter I've just recently done too. Buildings have to be naturally ventilated. You have to now understand that the air conditioning industry driven narrow comfort zones of 20 to 26 degrees centigrade are completely inappropriate in a warming world, that we have to adopt adaptive thermal comfort standards that Fergus will be talking about tomorrow. We need to instigate classifications of building systems that promote naturally ventilated and mixed mode buildings, not promoting fully air conditioned ones like the LEED and many other rating systems. We need to instigate a modal shift away from also air-driven HVAC systems. There's a huge move towards radiant heating and cooling systems, which is another business opportunity, not least because they reduce pathogen transmission between people and spaces, but they can also be low energy and more comfortable. We need to increase maybe ceiling to floor heights, not only in hospitals, but in offices and buildings. You know, the urge to build ever cheaper buildings must be resisted, because we're building for the long term, and we don't want buildings to lose their value overnight because they fail badly. We must shade and open windows and provide security and insect screens so people feel comfortable opening windows, and we must make that provision at an early design stage. Make natural ventilation training mandatory for all architects and engineers. You can go through a building engineering course or an architecture course and never be taught how to naturally ventilate a building. You're taught how to use a BIM model. That's it. Well, that's giving you the wrong answers. So rethink education. And we need transport. We need opening windows in all public transport, trains, buses, trams, simply for when those lights do go out. We need to think deeply and honestly about the future. We've had the pipe dreams. We need to build resilience for ordinary people and prioritize them above those interests of developers and consultants. We need to really face people. Architects must be responsible for building performance during the design. Planners must be held accountable for buildings that fail during extremes. Why are they allowing buildings on floodplains that are going to be washed away in an extreme flood event? Engineers must not be paid according to how much equipment they put in buildings, but be rewarded by how little those energy buildings use. Governments must ensure that those who write the building regulations or sit on planning and policy development committees do not stand to personally benefit, not because they are corrupt, but they are perceived to be corruptible. We need to decorrupt the system, and people must learn to value nature more and live with nature if they want to stay safe in a very different future. At the heart of it all is adaptive thermal comfort, needed to reconnect with the wisdom embodied in vernacular buildings. And all of this and more is in 34 chapters in a book that is out in, I'm afraid it's not until April next year, 34 chapters covering all of these different points that I've made. It's already, you can book it already online, and you can get 20% discounts available, and all libraries and so on should have that, because its hardback version is expensive, £190, I think, but that paperback will come out in a year or so. But we also, finally, because we have to change, we have to ask ourselves that in future, when our children and grandchildren are older, what sort of lives will they lead? Will we have made a difference or not? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Susan Rauf. I apologize for not being, logged in at the beginning of the presentation. In fact, I was, but I was not a host, so I was not able to introduce you. So I apologize for this. I'm not sure if I can introduce you now. to others.
I was introduced
despite
before
the
in
fact
the
that
opening session, so
yes.
that's
Okay.
why.
So thank you for being with us. I don't see any much of a questions. I think the first question I can see, I can post this. Just bob in the screen. Okay, I can read it straight away. Good afternoon. This is Sam, University of Seville, Spain. Dear Professor Susan, we just have confronted a building systematic failure with the Corona crisis, with most of our building stock shut down because they were no longer health safe. At least during COVID peak, do you share this perception? I guess we are running to another huge energy crisis in the short term, fast rise of cost and not enough gas for everybody. What is your feel about structural changes at the governmental level, or at least at big corporation levels, about shifting buildings paradigm? Do you feel society arrived to a turning point, demand better buildings? Thank you very much. So these are the questions from Sam.
Sam, I've been doing an awful lot on nosocomial infections, that is cross-infection between spaces and people in hospitals. And there's some really startling results that hospitals in Scotland are now showing these huge spikes of COVID cross-infection. Do you know, in December in British hospitals, 27% of the people who came in for treatment in hospitals who didn't have COVID caught COVID in the hospital, and something like 25% of them died. So hospitals are the canary in the coal mine. They are showing us how dangerous these spaces can be. So yes, first of all, we have to get rid of the people from the committees who may be seen to be personally profiting or representing professions that are profiting from development. So we need to clean out the stables and have the decision makers realize how important it is, because Oman is very interesting because of the typhoon you had 2 weeks ago and suddenly, or 3 weeks ago, and suddenly, whole areas were washed away. Well, why were they put on the wadis in the first place? Some of them, it's because there is the buck doesn't stop anywhere with planning systems. If you're in France, a mayor decides on the planning, and if that development floods, he is then criminally liable. The same happens in Scandinavia, that you cannot just keep on making all these decisions to put buildings here and there without doing that risk analysis. I think COVID is a game changer. I think that everybody from now on is going to really want to be in mixed mode buildings where you can open the windows because with the extreme climate events, then the power grids fail, the infrastructure fails, the lights go out. What they found in Hurricane Sandy in New York was that people were living in 30-story towers in flats with no opening windows, and they had to stay there. The streets were flooded. They couldn't open a window. They had to go to the loo, but they had no water. They couldn't go down 20 floors to get water to flush the loo. So the whole blocks would become putrid. Yeah. So now the task force, post-Sandy task force in Manhattan says 25% of all residential buildings in New York must be opening windows, 25% of all the windows. So all of these Maynard Keynes, the great economist, said that there is nothing so strong as an idea, and one idea cannot be changed by another idea. The only thing that changes an idea is the catastrophic changing of circumstances around it. And Sharjah has had 24-hour blackouts. What happens in Dubai with 24-hour blackouts? So I think all of these extreme events, which is why CATE is about comfort at the extremes. We are leading the way. We are lighting the way forward. So yes, Sam, all's changing, but you have to clear out those stables first and get government by the people, with the people, and for the people.
Thank you, Prof. Susan. Another question from Prof. Rijal, home from Japan. Thank you so much for your nice presentation. The energy use might be increased in the mixed mode buildings. How do you think? Do you have any design ideas?
Thank you, Harm. Well, my famous house in Oxford, the Oxford Eco House, was based on what I'd learned from the wind catchers of Yazd, how not to overheat. So that is in my Eco House book, Eco House Design Guide, 4th edition. But as an example of, it never gets too hot, it never gets too cold. And it's a 6-bedroom house. And last month, my gas and electric bill in Britain, with soaring prices, was £12.50. So yes, I'm thankful every day of my life for the fact that I learned the lessons of the wind catchers of Yazd.
Thank you, Prof. Susan. Another question from Indra Ganti. I think Professor Indra Ganti from Qatar University, if I'm not mistaken. Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. So I have a question. How do we change the attitudes of people and their reluctance to use higher air movement and fans being looked at as a poor man's cooling strategy? Thank you.
I think in offices, there is this desire to appear to be, sort of high end. The first places in many cities to get air conditioning were banks, so it was prestigious, or hotels, posh hotels. And people are under the impression that air conditioning is posh, it's good. Whereas now, post-COVID, what we see is that the absolutely safest way to purge spaces of viral load is to have fans on desks facing open windows, simply pushing air and the pathogens, the COVID, out of the space. So, that many people do not trust modern buildings now. So they, in New York or San Francisco or London, they don't want to go back to work because they think that building is going to infect them. Yeah. And so if you had mixed mode buildings where you're using fans not only to cool, but to purge those spaces, people would trust much more. So this is the catastrophic changing of circumstances that COVID has achieved. But what's really interesting is that in New York, where the businesses like KPMG or the, big banks own the buildings, they are forcing workers to go back into the office. Whereas in San Francisco, where you get high-tech businesses, they are not, because the individual workers for the high-tech industries are high-value individuals, and they don't own the buildings. So they can let them go. Whereas in New York, if you own the building, you don't want it to lose value by being seen to be empty during COVID. So there's a lot of very complex issues around it. But I think now, and you'll see in the Resilient Comfort book, that COVID has changed everything, and people will love a fan if they know it's not infecting them.
Thank you, Prof. Susan. I think this is a comment from Professor Aouni. Cities are now transferred from people realm to automobile realm. I don't know if you want to add anything on this, because it's not a question, just a comment.
Yeah, no. And I know that in Abu Dhabi, for instance, yeah, or you saw the street in Dubai, you know, you've got in those cities, you've got inside and outside. This has to be dealt with because that's a very brittle system. And I think in Abu Dhabi, where if you're out in the street going for a bus stop for public transport or so on, and you're in 40 degrees centigrade or 50 degrees centigrade, you cannot go out of those spaces, can you? I think the Gulf and the Middle East has to, you know, sort of, because that's an extremely hot condition, they have to probably design safe pathways through the city where people can walk through them, and basically say, you know, the car's all very well, but you have to put a place for people as well. Because if you have a car driven city and the lights go out and the power fails, like they had in Sharjah, I asked students at our Heriot Watt campus in Dubai, what did you do during the Sharjah blackout? Some of the girls went to the mall to go shopping because it was a cooled mall. The boys got in their cars to cruise up and down with the air conditioning on. And there's one girl who was foolish enough to go to the beach to try and cool off with a swim and ended up in hospital with sunstroke. But, you know, these are extremes. So you have to rethink the city. And if you look in old cities like Old Yazd, you'd have cool pathways through, tunnels where you could walk through and be thermally safe. So the 20th century was the century of the car. The 21st century has got to be something else, or else people won't survive. People will die.
Thank you, Prof. Susan. Another question from an audience. Dear Professor Susan, thank you very much for your engaging presentation, your multidisciplinary approach to the questions of comfort in buildings. What did your research in architecture gain?
I think that was Hom. I think we've had that one.
Is it?
Yeah.
Can gain from this. What are the limits of the research in our field from your perspective? No, it's not Professor Hom. It's from somebody else.
Limits.
Yeah.
Okay.
Limits of research in our field from your perspective.
Well, I personally know, having lived all over the world, been born in the tropics in Penang, growing up in the Australian bush, living 10 years in Iran and Iraq, excavating and studying, and working in Antarctica. You don't know your own limits until you go past them. And I think probably the biggest limits we face are those of our imagination. So this is why we have to get people to move beyond their limits. And that's why you have to teach students to go out and touch and feel real vernacular buildings, because it's in them that they will understand that all of the things that are beyond the very limited design models they're using, the magic. I mean, how would I have found out that Yazd, the basements of Yazd are connected to the mountain cools if I hadn't gone out and researched it myself? And there are deep and profound lessons that we can learn, but we have to go beyond our own limits.
Thank you, Professor Susan. I think we got a lot from you. We learned a lot. We have, myself, I have many questions, but I think I will not ask you on this because we're supposed to be on another session now.
Please send me you just Google my email at Heriot Watt and send me in questions. I'd be more than happy. I've got papers to back up everything I say.
Thank you very much. And we are looking forward for your new books on the resilience. Is it really resilience comfort?
Yeah, it's resilient comfort. We're very excited. There's fabulous contributions from around the world.
Okay, thank you very much. And we are happy that you join us today. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much indeed.
Bye.
Bye.